All right, we have the all clear. Judges, thank you very much for your time.
Are we good to go?
Yes, we are, Your Honor. Thank you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Toby Heitens. I'll be the presiding judge. We're here on the case of Stevie Rogers versus Drew Mars. Scoring judges, please look to the two buttons on the lower half of your screen and remember to keep your audio and video off unless the bailiff or I tells you to turn it on. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants, which means that the only people on the screen right now should be two of the advocates as well as me. We're ready to go. Could attorneys please make appearances for your client? You're muted.
My apologies. Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Ellen Wandrow, and I'm here today with my co-counsel, Delaney Cornforth.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And together, we represent the plaintiff in today's case, Stevie Rogers.
Good afternoon.
Your Honor, as we have been made aware that you have received a bench book containing relevant case materials, we have no documents to tender, and we are ready to proceed with trial at this time. Oh, you're muted now.
Sorry about that. Wonderful. Let's get appearances from the defense.
Good afternoon, Judge Heitens. My name is Karai Razadi, and I, along with my co-counsel, Riley Lee.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Ms. Lee.
Represent the defendant, Drew Mars, today.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mars.
Your Honor, we just have a couple of pretrial matters to tend to before we're ready to proceed.
Of course.
First off, we'd like to invoke Rules 603 and 615, the constructive swearing in and sequestration of all witnesses barring party representatives. And due to the Zoom nature of this trial, our party representatives will constructively be present throughout the trial.
Sure. We'll treat the parties as constructively present at all times and the non-party witnesses as constructively sequestered at all times.
Thank you, Your Honor. Additionally, we'd like to draw your attention to Stipulation 16, which states that Exhibits 1 through 7 have been pre-admitted in today's trial, and they can be referenced as such throughout.
Is that your understanding?
That's our understanding as well.
Terrific.
And Your Honor, finally, we just ask, as it's the first time we've had the pleasure of being in your courtroom, whether after sustained objection, you'd like us to move to strike or assume it's been stricken.
Well, there's never any need to move to strike questions because questions aren't evidence. If testimony has come in that you think should be stricken, please move to strike testimony only.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the defense is ready to proceed to opening statements.
Ms. Wandrow, is there anything else from the plaintiff before we begin?
No, Your Honor, I believe that covers it, and we are ready to move to opening statements as well.
Okay, great. So everyone should make sure they are in speaker view. I will do the same. The button is in the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking so that we won't accidentally switch from person to person. And with that, plaintiff, we'll hear your opening.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court? Counsel, members of the jury, the proof is in the prints, and the prints are on the pills. Today you will be hearing about the life and tragic death of Miss Agatha Lee. Miss Lee was a successful author who gained critical acclaim from her single published book, Death in a Bottle. As you will soon learn, she suffered from a severe allergy to an over-the-counter heartburn drug. So severe that a heart attack in reaction to the drug had already rendered her unable to live alone without a caretaker. This is where Drew Mars, the defendant, came in. The defendant was Miss Lee's caretaker for 10 years. And in February of 2018, he was declared to be the sole heir to Miss Lee's more than $20 million estate. But in July of 2018, Miss Lee's last living relative, her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers, came into her house and began to rekindle the relationship that they'd shared from years before. Unfortunately, this rekindling was soon interrupted when Miss Lee was found dead. On the morning of August 15th, 2018, a private investigator and police detective were called to the scene. At first, it was thought that Miss Lee had died of old age, but her granddaughter insisted upon an autopsy, which found that Miss Lee had been poisoned by that same over-the-counter drug that she was allergic to. An investigation into Miss Lee's death found fingerprints that suggested that her nightly prescribed arthritis medication had been swapped with the fatal over-the-counter pills that she was allergic to. Members of the jury, the proof is in the defendant's prints, and those prints are on the pills. At this point, I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but let's take a step back and clear up exactly what you're being asked to decide upon today. You are here to determine whether the defendant is liable for the wrongful death of Miss Lee. Wrongful death is most easily explained as when a person knowingly or purposely causes the death of another. As the plaintiff, we have the burden of proving this to you by a preponderance of the evidence, which simply means more likely than not. If by the end of trial today, you find that it is more likely than not that the defendant knowingly or purposely caused the death of Miss Lee by swapping her prescription medication with that over-the-counter drug that she was allergic to, then you must find the defendant liable. Throughout trial, you will hear evidence that will aid you in finding your verdict. Let's start with how the defendant knew that the pills would kill Miss Lee. You will hear how the defendant not only knew about Miss Lee's allergy to the over-the-counter medication, but that he knew if he were to swap one pill for the other, Miss Lee would take whatever he handed to her. Because the defense's own witness, Ms. Cabrera, heard Miss Lee tell him so. You will learn that even if the pills were swapped, Miss Lee couldn't have known the difference because the over-the-counter pills and the prescription medication that Miss Lee took every night were identical. You'll hear about a bag found in the defendant's closet with the defendant's fingerprints on its handle. And on the inside of the bag, a bottle full of the over-the-counter pills that killed Miss Lee. Another bottle full of the harmless prescription medication was found in the bathroom. And exactly 2 of those pills had the defendant's fingerprints on them. The proof is in those prints, members of the jury, and the proof leads to the defendant. You're also going to hear about why the defendant would do this. You will hear that once her granddaughter returned and they were able to rekindle their relationship, Miss Lee planned to change her will to name her granddaughter the sole heir. Eyewitnesses and evidence will show you that the defendant knew he was supposed to inherit the money in the previous will, and that he knew it was all about to be taken away. The defendant poisoned Miss Lee by swapping her pills in order to prevent this from happening, leaving behind a grieving granddaughter, an empty house, and as you're going to learn, the defendant left one more thing behind: a series of 3 damning fingerprints. At the end of trial today, my co-counsel is going to come speak to you. She's going to walk you back through all of the evidence, showing you again how the proof is in the prints, and ask you to find the defendant liable for the wrongful death of Miss Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. We'll hear the opening for the defense now.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Now, Miss Cornforth just came before you today and told you that it was Drew Mars who killed Agatha Lee, that it was Drew Mars who swapped her arthritis medication for Winterin pills, or apologies, who swapped her Winterin pills for chlorambutamine. But during today's trial, I want you to take a closer look at the evidence that seems too easy, too simple. Because when you look a little harder, you'll see that it was Drew Mars who was framed for fortune. Let's start at the beginning. Back in 2008, Drew Mars was studying nursing at a local college. He responded to an ad in a newspaper looking for a full-time live-in caretaker for an elderly woman named Agatha Lee. Drew responded to that ad and received that position. In 2011, followed Miss Lee all the way to Midlands, where he moved in to work as a full-time live-in nurse. At first, the relationship was that of any other patient or nurse. But over the years, they started to become friends. They started playing games together, watching movies. Drew looked at Miss Lee like he would his own grandmother. Eventually, Miss Lee started to open up about her personal life and about her family. Miss Lee told Drew that her only living family was her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers. She also told Drew Mars that she hadn't seen Stevie Rogers in over a decade. Now, Drew Mars was the only family she had left. That's why in February of 2018, Miss Lee left the entirety of her $20 million estate to Drew Mars in her will. See, members of the jury, Miss Lee wasn't an ordinary person. She was one of America's best-selling authors. She wrote Death in a Bottle, one of the most popular murder mysteries ever written. That meant that she was the sole owner of a $20 million estate. Now, the original beneficiary in that will was Stevie Rogers. But Miss Lee edited the will when she realized that Drew Mars was more of a grandson than Stevie Rogers was. And when Miss Rogers found out she had been disinherited, she was furious. You'll hear today from Ryan Cabrera, an biographer who met with Miss Lee that day, where Miss Lee told Miss Cabrera how upset she'd been to remove Stevie from the will, but that she was confident she had made the right decision. But Miss Rogers knew she had to come up with a way that would allow her to receive that $20 million. So she came up with a plan. Miss Rogers was a former law student, and she was aware of a piece of law known as the Slayer Statute. Now, the Slayer Statute basically prohibits those who are found liable to causing someone's death from inheriting their estate. Miss Rogers knew that if she could frame Drew Mars for the murder of her own grandmother, that it would be her who would receive that $20 million. Miss Rogers also knew that Miss Lee had a rare allergy to chlorandramine, a common over-the-counter heartburn medication. All she had to do now was switch those pills. On August 14th of 2018, Miss Rogers slipped into Miss Lee's bedroom and switched her Winterin pills for chlorandramine. She then took a black bag containing those pills and planted them in Drew Mars' closet. All she had to do now was wait. The next morning, Miss Lee was found unresponsive in her room, having died of a fatal allergic reaction to chlorandramine. Members of the jury, as the defense in today's case, we bear no burden of proof. It is the plaintiff who must show you that it was more likely than not that it was Drew Mars who caused the death of Agatha Lee. But members of the jury, I want you to look carefully at the evidence presented in front of you today. Because sometimes what's in front of you, well, that's just what it's supposed to look like. At the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Karai Razadi, will come before you and ask that you find Drew Mars not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Before the plaintiff calls its first witness, I'm going to ask everyone to please switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and witnesses at the same time during the examinations. And with that, the plaintiff, you may call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Michelle Bond to the stand.
Counsel, you can
May I
proceed
proceed?
whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Please state your name for the record.
Ms. Bond, your audio is off.
My apologies. The name is Michelle Bond.
What do you do for a living?
Counsel, I think your witness may have frozen for a moment. She may not have heard your question.
I will re-ask it. What do you do for a living, Miss Bond?
I'm a consulting detective. When there's a private inquiry or when the police are out of their depth, which is most of the time, they consult me.
Do you have any credentials or experience which qualify you as a consulting detective?
Yes, I have a private investigator's license here in Midlands, and I've also been a consulting detective for decades. Many of my cases made the papers, but I'd say the most famous were The Tragedy of the Part-Time Wardrobe and The Secret of the Meticulous YouTuber.
How are you involved in today's case?
I was hired by Stevie Rogers to investigate quite the peculiar case, the Manor murder.
How did you first become involved?
Well, I got a call precisely at 8:45 a.m. on August 15th of 2018. It was Ms. Rogers, and the news was riveting. Rogers claimed that her dear old Nana had been murdered, and she wanted me there as soon as possible. I arrived at the Lee Manor at 9:25 a.m.
What happened when you arrived at the manor?
Miss Lee was dead, all right, but no blood. There was no bruises or cuts that I could see on her body, so no signs of a struggle either. Just an 82-year-old woman, dead in her bed. At first glance, it seemed as if Miss Lee had passed from natural causes. Now, I've met lead detectives who lower the IQ of the entire room when they open their mouths, but luckily Detective Khan was not one of those detectives. With a little convincing, she ordered that an autopsy be performed on Miss Lee.
Were you able to review that autopsy?
Quite so.
What did you learn from it?
There were two kinds of pills in Miss Lee's body, good pills and bad pills.
What do you mean by good pills?
As I learned from the defendant, the good pills were the ones Miss Lee would take together every night before bed, which included aspirin, vitamin B, and a prescribed arthritis medication.
What did you mean by bad pills?
The bad pills were chloroandramine, an over-the-counter drug used to alleviate heartburn. Now, chloroandramine in Miss Lee's system may not have been noteworthy had it not been for one slight issue. Miss Lee was deathly allergic to it. I also learned that from the defendant.
I am showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 12. What is it?
Well, this is Ms. Lee's pill organizer on the morning that she was found dead. I saw the pill organizer itself during the investigation.
Does this photo accurately represent what you saw?
Yes, it does.
At this time, the plaintiff offers Exhibit 12.
No objection, Your Honor.
Exhibit 12 will be admitted.
What pills did Miss Lee take the night before she was found dead, according to the autopsy?
Well, the night before Miss Lee died, she should have taken all of her good pills like she did every night before hitting the sack. Her pill organizer shows that she did just that. She was found dead on Wednesday morning, and the pill organizer was empty for Tuesday night. The medical examiner, however, found that she had only taken 2 of the good pills, vitamin B and aspirin. She hadn't taken her arthritis medication in 24 hours. In place of the 2 arthritis pills she normally took were 2 heartburn alleviation pills. It was obvious to me what had happened.
Were Miss Lee's arthritis pills similar in appearance to the heartburn pills?
Yes, her prescribed arthritis pills look completely identical to the heartburn pills she was severely allergic to.
Where did the investigation lead next?
I decided to do some good old-fashioned snooping. I looked through the defendant's bedroom and found their laptop. There I found an email the defendant had sent to what seemed to be her friend. I took a photograph of the email.
One moment, excuse me. I'm showing you has been marked as Exhibit 13. What is it?
Well, this is the photo that I took of the defendant's email.
Does it appear to be the same as the last time you saw it?
Yes.
At this time, the plaintiff offers Exhibit 13.
Your Honor, pursuant to Rule 801D2A, defense has no objection.
Exhibit 13 will be admitted.
What did you learn from the defendant's email?
The defendant knew she was the sole heir to the entirety of Miss Lee's estate.
Were you at the reading of Miss Lee's will?
Yes, I, along with the defendant, Ms. Rogers, and Ms. Cabrera, were present on the day Miss Lee's lawyer announced who would be the heir to her fortune.
What happened at that reading?
Well, when Miss Lee's lawyer proclaimed that the heir was the defendant repeated over and over again, "I can't believe it. I had no idea." Wrong. Her emails proved that much. Enemies of the heir, beware.
Were there any pieces of forensic evidence collected from Lee Manor?
Yes, fingerprints. One was collected off a black bag found in the defendant's closet. 2 others were collected off good pills stored in Miss Lee's bathroom.
I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 15. What is it?
Well, this is that black bag I was just speaking of, the one found in the defendant's closet.
Does this appear to be an accurate representation of the bag that you saw during the investigation?
Yes.
At this time, the plaintiff offers Exhibit 15.
No objection.
It will be admitted.
What did you learn from that black bag?
Inside the bag was a pill container filled with the bad pills. A fingerprint analysis showed that the defendant had touched its zipper.
You
Objection, Your
mentioned
Honor, speculation.
What specifically portion of the answer, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor, specifically to the assertion that it had been the defendant who had touched the zipper. It is the defense's claim today that it was actually Stevie Rogers who had planted the bag in the closet, and therefore for Detective Bond to say that it had been Drew Mars who had touched the bag at that specific time would be speculative.
Response, Ms. Corn?
Yes, Your Honor. In a previous answer, Ms. Bond said that one fingerprint was collected off of the black bag found in the defendant's closet. Now, just now, she stated that a fingerprint analysis showed that the defendant had touched the zipper of the black bag. She is stating this statement because the fingerprint found on the black bag specifically was the defendant's. Therefore, the defendant had touched the zipper, and this is not speculation.
Well, counsel, I think she can say that. So maybe let's just clean up the record a little bit here. Plaintiff's counsel, I'm not going to grant the motion to strike at this point, but if you could ask the witness if she identified the fingerprint or was able to identify the fingerprint, just to close the loop on that. And if you're able to do that, I will not strike the testimony.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Bond, what did the fingerprint analysis show specifically regarding the black bag?
Well, the fingerprint analysis showed that Miss Mars had touched the zipper of the bag, leaving a partial print on it.
And who conducted that fingerprint analysis?
Detective Khan sent it back to her unit, and her unit fulfilled the fingerprint analysis.
Are you aware how many points the fingerprint was a match for the defendant?
16, I believe.
Now, you mentioned earlier that 2 fingerprints were also collected off of the good pills. Whose fingerprints were those?
Ah, yes, this helped me to answer the real mystery at the time. The good pills she would take each night were stored in her pillbox organizer by her bedside. I saw that for myself the first day I arrived at the manor, after Miss Lee was found dead. But if her good pills for the night had been switched with the bad pills, well, where then were the good pills? Well, those 2 good pills, having been taken out of Miss Lee's pillbox organizer and put back into the bottle, had the defendant's fingerprints on them. The proof was on the pills.
Thank you, Ms. Bond. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, you may cross-examine whenever you are ready.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Ms. Bond.
Good afternoon.
I just want to talk to you a little bit about what you saw and what you didn't see. You didn't see Drew Mars on August 14th, 2018, right?
No, I did not.
You didn't see Stevie Rogers on August 14th, 2018?
No.
In fact, you never actually met Miss Agatha Lee, isn't that right?
No, I did not, although I was a huge fan of her.
But you never met her in person before she died, right?
Like I said, no.
And you can't tell us anything about the relationship between Drew Mars and Agatha Lee, right?
Well, I do know that Drew Mars was her caretaker and that Drew Mars had been living with Miss Lee for the past 10 years in the Lee Manor. I had some talks with Drew Mars and also found that Drew Mars was the heir to Miss Lee's inheritance. I knew some things about the relationship when I came to do my investigation.
But Miss Bond, you can't tell us anything about their personal relationship, right?
I knew that there had been some tensions. They had been on good terms at some point, but I wasn't living with them in the Lee Manor. The things I know about the relationship, that were the things that I found during my investigation.
So, Miss Bond, I just want to be very clear for the jury. You don't know anything about the relationship between Drew Mars and Agatha
Objection,
Lee.
Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Response, Your Honor?
I apologize. I was unable to unmute myself briefly. I'm going to overrule the objection. This is cross. I think the witness is not being entirely responsive, so I'll give you a little leeway.
So, Ms. Bond, I want to be very clear. You can't tell us about anything about the relationship between Drew Mars and Miss Lee during that 10-year period which they lived together, right?
No, that's not true. As I said, I knew some things about the relationship. They must have been somewhat close to have Miss Lee put Drew Mars into her will. These things are the things that I found during my investigation. But you're right to say that I was not in the manor living with them for those past 10 years.
Fine. You do know, however, that there's no evidence that Drew Mars purchased chlorandramine, right?
Well, that's not necessarily true, no.
Ms. Bond, is it your testimony to that there is proof that Drew Mars purchased chlorandramine?
Well, what we found was that there was a period in which Drew Mars was by herself after dropping Miss Lee off for lunch.
Ms. Bond, I'm not asking you to speculate as to where Miss Mars might have gone during that time. I'm just asking you that you can't tell us, or you would agree with me that there is no evidence that Drew Mars purchased chlorandramine pills, right?
I'm confused by your question. No one saw Drew Mars purchase the pills. However, there was some evidence to make us believe that they had the time to purchase pills.
Okay, well, Ms. Bond, let me elaborate. You're aware there's no online record that Drew Mars purchased those pills?
No, there were also no receipts. They had thrown them away.
Ms. Bond, I'm not asking you to speculate as to what Drew Mars did. I'm just asking that you're aware that there is no online record, right, of him buying chlorandramine pills.
No online record. He paid in cash.
And like you said, Ms. Bond, there was no evidence of there was no receipt found to show that he purchased chlorandramine pills, right?
No.
Ms. Bond, you're aware that there was no video surveillance showing Drew Mars at a pharmacy, right?
No.
In fact, Ms. Bond, you'd actually agree with me that it's a little too convenient that black bag was found in Drew Mars' closet. Isn't that right?
Well, I thought about that at first. As a detective, you must think about all possible scenarios. However, all of the evidence that I accumulated led me to believe that Drew Mars didn't that Drew Mars was involved.
Ms. Bond, I want to be very clear here. Is it your testimony that you don't believe it was too convenient, a little convenient for that bag to be found in Drew Mars' closet?
No, as I said, at first I believed it was too convenient. However, with all the rest of the information that I got from my investigation, it no longer seemed as convenient.
Ms. Bond, you wrote a statement in preparation for today's case?
Yes.
Just a moment. Apologies, Your Honor, I'm having some technical difficulties again.
You're quite all right, counsel.
I apologize, Ms. Bond. It appears that I cannot pull up your affidavit in front of me right now. Do you have it in front of you?
Yes, I do have it in front of me.
Ms. Bond, could you please read aloud line 178 through 180?
So, found in Mars's closet, but isn't that just a little too tidy?
Ms. Bond, I'd ask you to read the entirety of 178 through 180, please.
Yes, I started at 178. Oh, isn't that just a little too tidy? Miss Mars has nearly a week to get rid of the murder weapon, but not only holds onto it, but keeps it in Mars's own closet.
So again, Ms. Bond, you'd agree
Objection,
with
Your
me?
Honor, to hearsay.
I'll give you a brief explanation of that.
Your Honor, witnesses are allowed to read from their affidavits for impeachment purposes, and I believe that opposing counsel is using this for the purpose of impeaching my witness. However, excuse me, I believe that the specific words that counsel used in their argument was convenient, which has a different connotation, and I would argue that this is an improper impeachment due to the difference in counsel's question and my witness's affidavit.
Ms. Lee, I'll give
Bond,
you,
Your Honor?
please.
Your Honor, I do believe that convenient and tidy are synonymous in this context. The assertion that Detective Bond believed it was too tidy, too convenient, too easy for that bag of pills to be found in Drew Mars' closet, it means the same thing.
Ms. Lee, do you think, is it my job to decide that, or is it somebody else's job to decide whether those mean the same thing?
Your Honor, I believe it would probably be the jury.
I agree. Objection overruled.
So Ms. Bond, again, just to be very clear, you'd agree with me that it was a little too convenient, a little too tidy for that black bag to have been found in Drew Mars' closet.
As I was saying, yes, at first, but once I completed my investigation, it was clear to me that Miss Mars had played a role in Ms. Lee's death.
Ms. Bond, I'll move along. So I want to talk about something you mentioned on direct examination. You said that Stevie called you and said that her grandmother had been murdered, right?
Yes, that is what she told me. She told me that her grandmother had been killed, that her grandmother had been murdered.
And you know that that was before any autopsy report had been done?
Yes.
You know that was before any toxicology report had been done?
Yes.
You know that at that point, all that anyone knew was that an 82-year-old woman had died in her sleep. Isn't that right?
Well, I don't know what anyone knew. Obviously, Miss Rogers had her suspicions. So I don't know if I can talk about that.
Ms. Bond, again, I'm not asking you to speculate what Stevie Rogers knew or thought. I'm just asking that you're aware that at that time, all the information that was available was that Miss Lee had died in her bed. There had been no toxicology report and no autopsy report. Isn't that right?
Yes, this is correct.
So finally, Ms. Bond, I want to talk about your employer. You're not affiliated with any police department, isn't that right?
No,
You haven't received any formal police training, isn't that right?
no, I have a private investigator's license.
But you've never received any formal police
Objection,
training
Your
from...
Honor. Relevance. Excuse me. I will wait.
Ms. Lee, please finish your question and then we'll take up any objection after we've completed.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Bond, you have no formal police training. You've never trained with Midlands Police?
No, I've never trained with the Midlands Police. I have worked with them, but I've never trained with them. In fact, I worked with Detective Khan in this case.
I would renew my objection to relevance, Your Honor.
Overruled.
So Ms. Bond, yes or no to my question? You have no formal police training and you've never trained with the Midlands Police Department, isn't that right?
Yes, that's right.
You're a detective for hire, right, Ms. Bond?
Yes, I'm a consulting detective.
And you were hired by the plaintiff in today's case.
Yes, I was.
And the plaintiff in today's case will pay you $25,000 for your work in today's case, isn't that right?
For testifying during trial, I was paid for the work that I did during my investigation. However, I'm not being paid to be here today.
Ms. Bond, that wasn't my question. My question was simply that the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers, will be paying you $25,000. Yes or no?
I've already been paid that $25,000 for my work during the investigation.
Again, Ms. Bond, I just want to be very, very clear. You have received $25,000 from the plaintiff, yes?
Yes, this is true. I've already received that $25,000.
Thank you, Ms. Bond. Nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, do you have any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Okay, Ms. Bond, the witness is excused with the thanks of the court. And I don't believe you need to remain in the courtroom unless the parties intend to recall you. So thank you for your testimony. Plaintiff, you may proceed with your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers to the stand.
And seeing everyone on the screen, plaintiff, you may begin when you're ready.
Please state your name for the record.
My name is Stevie Rogers.
Miss Rogers, do you live here in Midlands?
Yes, Midlands has been my home since 2018 when I moved in with my Nana.
I'd actually like to talk about your grandma, Agatha Lee. What was your relationship with her like?
When I was growing up, she was my best friend. We were almost inseparable. Then in 2008, my parents died, which affected Nana and my relationship.
How did your relationship change after the death of your parents?
Well, I took off. I traveled. I still loved my Nana, but spending time with her after my parents died was a constant reminder of what I'd lost. The pain was unbearable. But 2018 was the 10-year anniversary of my parents' death, and I needed to be with my only living family, my Nana. That's when we reconnected.
Were you able to be with her?
Yes. When I moved in with my Nana, I felt like I was home again. Dealing with my parents' death suddenly wasn't so difficult. That's what made her death that much harder. I had just gotten my Nana back, and then she was taken away from me.
Miss Rogers, I know that today is difficult for you, so if at any point you need to take a break, just let me know, okay?
Okay.
Now, I'd like to talk about the time that you were living with your grandma, Agatha Lee. During this time, did you ever handle her medications?
No. Before Nana's heart attack in 2008, she took care of her meds herself. She was incredibly independent. I like to think she's who I get it from. But then, after her heart attack, she hired a caregiver who managed it, so I never had to. Honestly, I don't even know the medications that Nana took.
Miss Rogers, I'd like to move on to the 14th of August. Did you talk to Miss Lee on that day?
Of course. I spent time with her every day. And on the 14th, we actually talked about her will.
Had you discussed her will before this?
No, but I had seen it after my parents died. Since I was the only family she had left, at that point, she was leaving her estate to me.
Did that ever change?
Yes. At some point, I found out that I was removed from the will and that her caretaker had replaced me.
How did that make you feel?
I'll be honest, it hurt, but it wasn't anyone's fault but my own. I knew the two of them were close, so I wasn't surprised. I respected my Nana's decision. I didn't need to be in her will. I just wanted to be in her life.
And Miss Rogers, when you say her caretaker, are you referring to the defendant, Drew Mars?
Yes, I am.
Let's return back to the 14th. Now, you said that you spoke about the will. Do you remember the specifics of that conversation?
Yes. Nana said that she was putting me back in the will. She told me she loved me and was so glad we were together again. She said she was going to leave her entire estate to me. I was shocked. I didn't expect it.
Do you know if she told the defendant the same information?
She didn't have to. I mean, when we opened the door, Drew was standing right outside. He jumped back like he had his ear to the door.
Well, Miss Rogers, did the defendant do anything that indicated to you that she actually had her ear to the door?
Yes. Right after Nana and I left the room, he mouthed, "No way," to me. His face was red, eyes squinty, fists clenched. Obviously, he wasn't happy.
When was the next time that you saw Miss Lee on that day?
When she got home from lunch, we watched a couple of movies and had dinner in her study. I said goodnight to her at about 9:30. I wish I'd known that those moments were going to be the last ones I'd had with her. I would have hugged her more, told her how much she means to me. Something.
Miss Rogers, did you see anybody else after you said goodnight to your grandmother?
Yes. About 5 minutes later, I saw Drew tiptoeing to Nana's room.
What was the defendant doing when you saw them tiptoeing toward Miss Lee's bedroom?
Drew had his right arm raised with his fist closed like this. It looked like he was carrying something, but I couldn't see what it was.
Miss Rogers, was the defendant the last person you saw before Miss Lee died?
Yes. The last thing I saw before waking up to the news that my Nana was gone was Drew going to her room in the middle of the night.
Thank you, Miss Rogers. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, you may begin your cross whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Rogers.
Good afternoon.
You had access in 2008, you got access to a trust fund. Isn't that right?
Yes. When my parents passed, I was given access to my trust fund.
That trust fund had $2 million in it, right?
Yes, and some odd change.
And you claimed on direct examination, well, that you and your grandmother were very close, right?
Yes, we were.
But it's true, isn't it? That from 2011 to 2018, you didn't visit your grandmother a single time, right?
No, like I said earlier, I grew apart from my Nana. I mean, I still loved her and valued our relationship, but the pain was too much to be back home.
So, Ms. Rogers, in those 8 years, you didn't see your grandma once, right?
No, I called her though and sent her some letters.
Well, Ms. Rogers, that's not actually true, is it? You didn't send her a single letter from 2011 to 2018, did you?
I reached out to her, but not as much as she reached out to me.
Ms. Rogers, you had one phone call with her in 8 years.
A couple of phone calls.
Is it your testimony here today that you called her more than once in those 8 years?
I called her once or twice.
So you called her more than once. That's your testimony here today.
I know I called her on her birthday. So I guess once.
One time in 8 years.
Yes.
During those 8 years, you weren't having any financial problems, were you?
No.
The trust fund still had money left, right?
Objection, Your Honor, to relevance. May I be heard?
No, defense counsel, give me a brief proffer on what the relevance is, according to you.
Absolutely, Your Honor. We're using this evidence to show that Miss Rogers, well, she didn't go back to her grandmother's house because she loved her. She went back because she needed money.
Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I'll give you a response, Ms. Wondrow.
I'd actually like to renew my objection or change my objection to 403 more prejudicial than probative. May I be heard?
So you're conceding it does have probative value?
Yes, Your Honor, I misspoke when I objected
That's
earlier.
fine.
My
Please
apologies.
give me the prejudicial argument.
So opposing counsel is bringing this testimony onto the record in order to try to insinuate that Miss Rogers only went back to see her grandmother when she ran out of money. Now, counsel is more than welcome to ask Miss Rogers about the times she went back to see her grandmother and about the status of her trust fund at that time. But to phrase the question in a way that counsel is by asking it was only after you ran out of money insinuates to the members of the jury that that was the only reason, when in reality, this witness has already testified that she went home because it was the 10-year anniversary of the death of her parents.
Defense counsel, I'll give you the last word.
Your Honor, opposing counsel is exactly right. We are using this to show that the only reason Miss Rogers went back was because she needed money. It's our contention in today's case that she's actually the one who killed her grandmother for money. So we're using this to show the probative value here is that she needed money and that's why she went back. There's no unfair prejudice in this line of question.
I'm not sure I see the unfair prejudice, and I think at minimum it goes to weight, not admissibility, so overruled.
So Miss Rogers, during those 8 years, you were doing well financially, right?
Yes, I was.
The trust fund still had money in it, didn't it?
Yes.
Then in June of 2018, your trust fund ran out, didn't it?
It was around then that it started to get very low. Yes.
At that time, you didn't have a job, right?
No, I didn't.
You had no way of making money.
No.
Your grandmother had removed you from her will just a few months prior, right?
Back in February, yes.
And so just 1 month after your trust fund ran out, you showed up to your grandmother's house for the first time in 8 years. Isn't that true?
Yes, I showed up on the 4th of July, 2018, the 10-year anniversary of my parents' passing.
It had been so long since you'd seen your grandmother that you had to hire a private detective to find out where she lived, right?
Yes. Being in the home back in Alabama must have been too hard on her, and she moved to Midlands a couple years after my parents died.
Ms. Rogers, I'd like to talk to you about your time at Lee Manor. On August 14th, you had a conversation with your grandmother about her will, right?
Yes, that's when she told me that she was making me the sole heir and taking Drew off of it.
That's right. You claim that your grandmother told you she'd give you everything, right?
Yes, because that's what she told me.
But there was no lawyer present in that room, right?
No, she said she would be reaching out to her lawyer to arrange a time to write up a new will.
But redirecting you back to my question, there was no lawyer in that room?
No, it was just a conversation about the will.
There was nobody else present in the room, right?
Aside from Drew listening outside of it, there was no one in the room. No.
And you know that your grandmother never actually changed her will to reflect what you say happened, right?
Yes, because Drew killed her before she could.
Your Honor, move to strike is speculation.
Well, counsel, I think the only objection you can make on cross is that she was non-responsive. Are you arguing that it was non-responsive to your question?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness went well beyond the question and speculated as to what happened to her grandma.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, counsel, please.
Well, we're here today in court precisely to find out if the defendant is responsible for the death of Miss Lee. Now, if counsel is going to say that the plaintiff, my apologies, Your Honor, allow me to start over.
That's fine.
Now, this witness answered counsel's question. The only time that objection of non-responsive can be raised is when the witness does not answer the counsel's question. Now, just because the witness went on further and didn't give counsel the exact answer they wanted doesn't mean that it was not responsive.
So I agree with the plaintiff's counsel that the witness can respond to the question. I don't think it's carte blanche just because she answered for her then to answer a different question. So I'm going to strike the latter portion as non-responsive to the question.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, I'd like to talk to you about something called the Slayer statute. You know what that is, right?
I'm sure everyone does. It's pretty common knowledge.
So the Slayer statute says that you can't receive someone's inheritance if you're shown to be responsible for their death. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, that's something that you were familiar with before your grandmother died, right?
Well, I did go to law school for a couple of years, so yes.
I'm sorry, Ms. Rogers, I couldn't quite hear you there with the connection. What was that?
I did go to law school for a couple of years, so yes, I was aware of it.
So in the circumstance you were in, two things needed to happen for the Slayer statute to come into effect, right? Your grandmother had to die, right?
I'm sorry, you're talking about before my Nana passed?
That's correct.
I guess I didn't think about it before she passed, so I didn't think about that then. But
Well,
after she passed, yes.
The second thing that would have to happen for you to receive the inheritance under the Slayer statute is that Drew Mars would have to be shown to be the killer, right?
That's correct. That's why I'm in court today, because Drew did it.
And you knew all that before your grandmother passed away, isn't that right?
I knew of the Slayer statute before, if that's what you're asking.
Well, Ms. Rogers, it actually wouldn't have been that hard to frame Mr. Mars, would it?
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation.
Yeah, I think the question as phrased calls for speculation, so I will sustain that.
I'll rephrase, Your Honor. You knew that Mr. Mars was the one who handled Miss Lee's medication, right?
All Drew's job is her caretaker.
I'm sorry, I think my connection might not be working. I can't quite enter. Is it my connection or?
I think it's Ellie's or
It's my
Stevie's connection.
Very bad.
Sorry, I'm just having some trouble understanding the answer. I'll just re-ask that question because I didn't hear the answer. You knew that Mr. Mars was the one who handled Miss Lee's medication, right?
Yes, as my Nana's caretaker, that was his job.
You knew that your grandmother was allergic to something called chloroandramine, right?
Yes, Drew was actually the one who told me about that allergy when I moved back into the manor in 2018.
You knew where your grandmother kept her pill organizer, right?
Yes, it was in her room, I believe.
And on the day she died, you were actually home alone for several hours, weren't you?
I was home for a few hours while my Nana went to lunch, yes.
During that time, you could have gone into your grandmother's room if you wanted to, right? There was nothing stopping you.
I suppose there was nothing stopping me, but that was Nana's space. So I didn't go in there unless she asked me to.
You also knew which room in the house was Mr. Mars's room, right?
Well, of course, there were only 3 of us living in the house.
And to the best of your knowledge, there were no locks on the doors to Mr. Mars's room, right?
I don't know. I'd never been in Mr. Mars' room until the investigation.
But it's true, isn't it, that you didn't think there were any locks on his doors, right?
Yeah, I didn't think there were, but I can't be sure.
So assuming there weren't, nothing would have stopped you from going into that room, right?
Objection, Your Honor.
On what grounds?
Counsel is misleading the jury by assuming that the witness, by asking the jury or asking the witness to assume that they had said yes and then speculate into what possibly could have happened if there were not any locks. The witness clearly stated that she can't be sure that there weren't locks, and then counsel said, well, assuming there weren't, there would be nothing stopping you, and then continued. He's assuming something that we don't know, that nobody has an ability to say whether it was true or not, and then asking the witness to speculate based on that assumption.
Your Honor, I can rephrase.
That's great. I think there's a way you can rephrase it to get around this objection, but for now, I'll sustain the objection.
Ms. Rogers, to the best of your knowledge, there was nothing stopping you from going into that room, right?
I suppose not, but I had never had a reason to go into Drew's room. I wouldn't have wanted Drew to go into my room, so I wouldn't have gone into his.
But redirecting you back to my question, to the best of your knowledge, there was nothing stopping, right?
Your Honor, objection to speculation. Now, this question, though counsel is saying to the best of your knowledge, he's still asking the witness to speculate because she would have no idea of if there was something there to stop her. Whatever counsel is insinuating may or may not have been there, she's still being asked to speculate.
I think that goes to weight, not admissibility. You're certainly free to point out that there may be things she doesn't know of, but I think it's with fair game for him to point out that she's not aware of any reason she couldn't have. So overruled.
Now, Ms. Rogers, I'd like to talk to you about the next step, when your grandmother was found dead. Well, you were actually the first person to call it a murder, weren't you?
Yes, I was. My Nana was healthy. Something had to have happened.
Well, when the police arrived, you insisted that they run a toxicology screen, right?
Yes, I did. Nana was healthy. There were no stab wounds, nothing that showed that she'd been shot or anything of the like. So she had to have been poisoned.
And so, Ms. Rogers, you insisted on the tox screen, right?
Yes, I did. And it was a good thing I did because that's how they found the chloroandramine.
Well, you actually knew that that tox screen would tell us she was killed with chloroandramine before the results came back, didn't you?
No, I didn't.
Well, it's true, isn't it, that you said you were confident that that's what that would show, right?
I was confident that it would show she'd been poisoned, but I didn't know by what.
Ms. Rogers, it's true, isn't it, that you predicted that tox screen would show she was poisoned with chloroandramine, isn't it?
I didn't know that it was going to show she was poisoned with chloroandramine. I was positive it was going to prove that she'd been poisoned.
So, Ms. Rogers, you were confident it would show she was poisoned?
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered. This question has been asked and answered by the witness 4 times now.
Your Honor, I'm trying to clarify the witness's answer.
I'm going to give you a little bit of leeway because once again, I don't think the witness is being entirely responsive, but we are getting near the end of this line of inquiry.
So you were confident that it would show she was poisoned, right?
Yes, I was.
You were so sure that the tox screen would show she was poisoned that you actually filed this lawsuit before the results even came back. Isn't that right, Ms. Rogers?
Yes, I filed this lawsuit on the 20th of August.
Before you saw the results of the toxicology screen, right?
Yes, I was positive that that's what it was going to show. I was right.
Ms. Rogers. Thank you, Ms. Rogers. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Is there a redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You're right.
Ms. Rogers, I'd like to discuss some of the medication that Miss Lee was taking. Do you know what Miss Lee took for arthritis pain?
I didn't even know that Nana had arthritis until this happened. Like I said earlier, I was gone for a while. I should have come back sooner, spent more time with her. It's one of my biggest regrets.
Do you know what vitamins Miss Lee takes?
No, she kept all her medicine in her room or study. I never saw specifically what vitamins she took.
Well, Miss Rogers, do you have any idea how many pills Miss Lee took every night?
No, that was all Drew. I had no reason to touch her meds since she had a live-in caretaker.
Well, Miss Rogers, what about prior to when she had a caretaker? Have you ever handed Miss Lee any pill?
No. When I spent time with Nana, she did everything herself. Like I said, she was a very independent woman.
Have you ever handled Miss Lee's pill organizer?
No, I'd never even touched it. I know that Drew touched it every Saturday, but other than that, I didn't know much about it.
Miss Rogers, have you ever purchased a drug called chloroandramine over the counter?
No, I didn't even know you could get it without a prescription until Drew told me. He told me you could get it at any drugstore. No ID necessary.
Thank you, Miss Rogers. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Is there any recross?
There is, Your Honor.
You may proceed when you're ready.
Ms. Rogers, you were asked a lot about the pills that your grandma was and wasn't taking. But I'd just like to get something straight. You were aware before your grandmother died that you could get chloroandramine at any pharmacy, right?
Yes, that's what Drew told me when I moved back in.
That's right. You were aware before your grandmother died that you could buy it without a license or identification, right?
Yeah, it wasn't like some of those meds that you need an ID for.
And Ms. Rogers, you were aware before your grandmother died that all it would take is one pill of chloroandramine to kill her. Isn't that right?
That's what Drew told me.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Anything
Nothing further, Your
else?
Honor.
Anything else from the plaintiff?
Sorry, no, Your Honor.
Okay, no apology necessary. Ms. Rogers, you are excused with the court's thanks.
Thank you.
Plaintiff, do you have anything else, any further evidence for the court?
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff rests our case in chief, and we ask for a brief recess. Does time allow for 10 minutes?
We've been instructed to do no more than 5. It is currently 4:59 on the East Coast. We will come back at 5:05.
Perfect.
I'm asked to remind my fellow judges that the video is being publicly broadcast via YouTube, so I would keep your video off because the live stream will continue during the break. Thank you.
And is our bailiff gonna put us in breakout rooms?
That is my understanding.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, judges, we are nearing the end of our 5-minute break, so I'm about to merge our students back into the room. If you could confirm that you are also back, either by turning on your video briefly or just message me to let me know that you're here. It looks like I'm just waiting on Ben and Brittany. If the two of you are here, if you could let me know. Thank you. All right, Your Honor, all judges have confirmed that they are back from their break and the students are filing back in now. I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, everyone is back and ready to go. Defense, you may call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor, the defense calls Drew Mars.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mars.
Good afternoon.
Counsel, you may proceed when you're ready.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, my name is Drew Mars.
And what do you do for a living, Mr. Mars?
Well, currently I'm not really working, but my previous job and really the only job I've ever had was the in-home caretaker for Agatha Lee.
How long did you work as Miss Lee's caretaker?
Something like 10 years. I think it was from 2008 to 2018. I started working for her when I was in college. I was getting my nurse's degree, and spending all that time together, we grew pretty close. I thought of Agatha as a grandmother to me.
Would you say that you and Miss Lee were close right before your death?
Yes, we were very close. Like I said, spending all that time together, we were like family, and I always looked up to her.
Why would you say that?
Well, the reason Agatha needed an in-home caretaker is because she had a heart attack. She's allergic to this drug called chloroandramine, which she accidentally took a dose of, which led to that heart attack. And she made a full recovery, which I always admired her for.
So, Mr. Mars, you mentioned before that you worked as her primary caretaker. Do you know what medications Miss Lee took?
Yeah, so she took one pill, one vitamin B pill every day, one aspirin every day, and 2 pills of Winterin. It's a arthritic medication.
Why was it important to make sure that you kept Winterin in the house specifically?
Well, Winterin looked the exact same as chloroandramine, the same drug that she was allergic to. So I had to be extra cautious to keep that out of the house.
And how did you administer Miss Lee her medication?
It was pretty simple. I would do it once a week, every Saturday. I would take her pill divider and fill it up with her pills. And then I'd just leave it on her bedside table and she'd take them herself before bed each night.
So Mr. Myers, I want to talk a little bit more about your relationship with Miss Lee. Did you two live alone?
We did. That was until July 4th of 2018 when Stevie Rogers came to live with us.
Who's Stevie Rogers?
Well, Stevie is Agatha's only grandchild.
Had you met Miss Rogers before July of 2018?
Yeah, I had. Stevie, she used to come around a lot, actually, and her and Agatha were connected at the hip, it seemed like. They did everything together, but it didn't stay like that.
What do you mean?
Around 2011, I think Stevie stopped coming around. To what I know, she stopped responding to Agatha's texts, emails, calls as well. And it was just really weird to see, you know, because they used to be so close. And now they were becoming so distant. And, you know, I honestly wondered if Agatha would ever see Stevie again until she showed up that day.
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation. This witness has relayed information about, or my apologies, lack of foundation. This witness has relayed all this information that they knew about Agatha Lee and Stevie Rogers. However, we have not heard any foundation as to how the witness knows this information. And the witness knows this information based on being told by Miss Lee. So therefore, the information the witness is relaying is based on hearsay.
So I'm going to give defense counsel a chance to respond, but before I do that, counsel, the witness said a number of things just now. Could you just clarify what he just said are you objecting to? I think it would be helpful for the court and for opposing counsel to understand what part of the answer you're objecting to.
Yes, Your Honor. So the beginning portion of the witness's answer was fine. However, then the witness stated, "I think," and then stated that their relationship had changed. And then the witness said that as far as he knows, Miss Rogers stopped calling and emailing and things of that nature. So everything after that, I think, is based on information that he got from Miss Lee, which is based on hearsay.
Ms. Lee, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, Your Honor. As I understand it, the opposing counsel's argument is twofold. There's a speculation objection and a hearsay objection. Is that correct?
That's my understanding as well. Please,
Okay.
yeah, give your answer to both of them.
Yes, Your Honor. So in regards to the speculation objection, we've already heard testimony that Miss Rogers hadn't visited Miss Lee in a number of years, that she rarely called, that she didn't visit. We've also heard that Drew Mars had been living in Lee Manor for a decade. It's certainly within Mr. Mars' purview to say that Miss Lee and Mr. Rogers hadn't spent time together in a long time. Referring to the hearsay objection, the statements from Miss Lee, we are not offering them for the truth of the matter in this context. There's already been testimony elicited that Miss Rogers hadn't shown up in a while, that Miss Lee hadn't heard from Miss Rogers in a long time. And in this context, we're just using it for the effect on the listener, Drew Mars, that Mr. Mars knew about the relationship.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think what the witness has actually said is based on his impressions, and I think he probably has enough foundation to say that. I will agree with the plaintiff to this extent, though. If we start offering statements by a non-available declarant, I think we're going to have some hearsay problems, but I think I'll overrule the objection to what he has said to this point.
So, Mr. Mars, from your limiting it to your own perception of what you noticed while you were living at Lee Manor, what was your understanding of the relationship between Miss Lee and Miss Rogers?
When she lived there before, or what time period are you talking about? I'm sorry.
Before Miss Rogers moved into Lee Manor.
Oh, I mean, I didn't hear anything about calls or texts from Stevie, and they just seem distant, is all I know.
So did that relationship change after Miss Rogers moved into the house?
Yeah, Agatha seemed really excited about Stevie moving back in, and I mean, they became close again from what I saw. Like, they started playing games and watching movies and eating dinner together. I mean, Agatha seemed genuinely happy about it.
Did that relationship ever change?
It did. The day before Agatha passed, August 14th, 2018, I was bringing Agatha her tea in the study like she asked, and I overheard a conversation between her and Stevie.
What did you overhear?
Stevie was asking Agatha to put her back in the will.
Did Miss Lee respond?
Agatha said no. She said something about wanting Stevie to stand up on his own 2 feet.
Did anything happen after that?
Well, Stevie didn't say anything, I don't think, but she stormed out of the room.
Did she mention anything to you?
She did, yeah. She just looked at me and said, "Don't count your millions just yet."
So, Mr. Mars, do you know where Miss Rogers was? I'm sorry, take a step back. What happened after that conversation?
Well, that was around 11 a.m., so then it was approaching on noon. So around that time, I took Agatha into town to meet with Ryan Cabrera. She's this autobiographer who was writing a book on Agatha at the time, and they seemed to be friends. They met quite a bit. So I dropped her there off for lunch, and then I went around to run some errands.
Do you know where Miss Rogers was during this time?
No, last I saw, she was at the house, Lee Manor, but I wasn't with her that afternoon.
So after you returned home, what'd you do?
Well, when we got back, I just washed up and then I started making dinner and I brought it to Stevie and Agatha in Agatha's study. And that was around 6:30, I think.
After bringing Miss Lee her dinner, what did you do after that?
After that, I went to my room and then I read for a while and then I just fell asleep at about 9:30. And I didn't wake up again through the night.
What did you do the next morning?
I woke up at 7, like I usually do, and I went for a walk outside. And then I came back in to make Agatha a coffee because she drinks coffee in the morning. And then I brought it up to her room.
When you got to Miss Lee's bedroom, what happened?
Well, I knocked on the door and then I came in and I set the coffee on her bedside table. And that's when I realized that she wasn't moving. And so I tried to wake her up and she didn't wake up, not even when I shook her.
So what did you decide to do?
I ran to Stevie's room and I started pounding on her door until she came out. And then the two of us, we ran back in there. And at that point, I just collapsed on the ground. I was in shock. I didn't know what happened. And I think Stevie called the police.
Mr. Mars, do you know how Miss Lee died?
From what I know, from the autopsy, she died from chloroangiomine. And, I was supposed to be her caretaker, and I couldn't keep the one thing that she was allergic to out of the house.
Mr. Mars, I hate to ask this, but I do want to address the plaintiff's allegations directly. Did you kill Miss Agatha Lee?
No, absolutely not. I would never do that to her.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. Nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Mars, as we've established, you worked as a caretaker for Miss Agatha Lee from 2008 until the day she died, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I started part-time, and then after a couple years, I became full-time living in the house.
So you worked for Miss Lee for almost a decade, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And Mr. Mars, you feel that Miss Lee was very generous with you over that decade, don't you?
Yeah, she was. I mean, she paid me a salary, food, lodging, and even for my medical expenses. It was a really nice job.
That's right, Mr. Mars. For 10 years, Miss Lee paid for your housing, right?
Yeah.
For 10 years, she covered all of your medical expenses, right?
Yeah, she did.
For 10 years, you had no car or gas expenses, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Miss Lee even paid for you to finish your college education, didn't she?
Yeah, and she offered to have me go back to college, and she said she would pay for that as well.
For 10 years, on top of paying for all of that, Miss Lee also paid you a salary for your work, didn't she?
Yeah, I was salaried.
A salary that, at the time of her death, was $80,000 a year, correct?
Yeah, that's right. She started lower, and then she just gradually raised it each year.
But Mr. Mars, even though she gradually raised your salary up to the point where you were making $80,000 a year and you had no expenses, you only had $20,000 in savings at the time of her death, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I sent most of my money back home to my family because they needed it more than I did.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about what you knew on the day that Miss Lee died.
Okay.
You knew that Miss Lee had a will, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You knew this because in 2018, Miss Lee showed you a change in her will, didn't she?
Yes, she showed me that I was the sole inheritor of her estate, and I was shocked by that.
This change, making you the sole inheritor of the estate, well, that meant that when Miss Lee died, you would inherit $20 million, right?
Yeah, I didn't know how much money it was at the time, but I figured it was something like that because of the book she wrote, Death in a Bottle.
Well, you didn't know exactly how much it was at the time, but Mr. Mars, you actually assumed it was much more than $20 million, didn't you?
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. Agatha lived pretty frugally. You know, she wasn't a very outgoing person, so she stayed in the house quite a bit and never asked for much.
And Mr. Mars, you needed that money, didn't you?
No, I didn't need that money.
Mr. Mars, you needed that money because your brother was sick, right?
Yeah, my brother could have used that money, of course.
In fact, Mr. Mars, your brother was in worse health than Miss Lee, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right.
You were worried that your brother would die before Miss Lee, weren't you?
I was, yeah.
And if your brother were to die before Miss Lee, well, you wouldn't be able to use that $20 million to help your brother, would you?
No, but I would still be able to use it to help the rest of my family. We have a big family and we never came from wealth.
Now, I'd like to talk about your relationship with Miss Lee's grandchild, Stevie.
Okay.
Stevie moved into Miss Lee's home with you and Miss Lee in July of 2018, correct?
Yeah, that's the time.
And as you said on direct examination, Miss Lee seemed to embrace Miss Rogers' arrival within days, didn't she?
Yeah, at first, Agatha seemed a little wary, thought that maybe Stevie just wanted money, but eventually she warmed up to her and they seemed like their old selves again.
And once they got back to their old selves again, well, Miss Lee didn't have time for you anymore, did she?
I don't know what you mean by that. I still just did my job and lived at the house.
Well, Mr. Mars, Miss Lee stopped spending as much time with you, didn't she?
Yeah, that's correct.
She and Stevie began having meals together without you.
Yeah.
They began watching movies together without you, right?
Yeah, they didn't necessarily exclude me, but I just, I thought I'd leave family alone together.
Well, actually, Mr. Mars, they started spending time in Agatha's study, right?
Yeah.
Now, on August 14th, you overheard a conversation between the two of them in that study, didn't you?
Yeah, that's when Stevie asked Agatha to change the will, to add her back into it.
And of course, you claim that Miss Lee said no, right?
Yeah, Agatha said no. That's what I heard. She said something, like I said, about wanting Stevie to stand up on his own 2 feet and not have to rely on her.
But Mr. Mars, you would agree that Miss Lee made a phone call during your drive to where she was having lunch, didn't she?
Yeah, she called Kirby briefly. She calls Kirby a lot.
And in over 10 years of working for Miss Lee, the only person named Kirby that you met was Miss Lee's personal attorney, right?
Yeah, she has a personal attorney.
And in the conversation that you heard with her personal attorney on the way to lunch, she requested a meeting for that week, didn't she?
Yeah, they met quite
Your Honor,
often.
your side?
Your Honor, the statement that was elicited is a question that Miss Lee asked. Questions have no inherent truth value, therefore this is not hearsay.
Counsel, could you, in order to rule on that, I'm going to ask the witness constructively outside the hearing of the jury to describe as clearly as he can what he heard Ms. Lee say.
Yeah, Miss Lee asked if she could set up a meeting later in the week with Miss Doolittle, Kirby Doolittle.
Ms. Lee, your response to that with that proffer.
Yes, yes, Your Honor. The statement that Miss Lee was looking for a meeting with her lawyer, the defense is certainly using that for the truth of the matter. The truth being that Miss Lee was looking to meet with her lawyer, meaning that she was planning on changing her will, meaning that Drew Mars would have an incentive to kill Agatha Lee. If Miss Lee had no plans to change the will, as Drew Mars just testified, then there's no incentive for Drew Mars to commit the murder. Therefore, the defense is using this piece of evidence for the truth of the matter.
So, Ms. Wanderer, I know that your first order argument is that you're not using it for the truth, but is there any exception that you would cite as well?
Your Honor, if we are going to say that this is, in fact, hearsay, then yes, that would fall under the exception 8033, present sense impression. This is Miss Lee stating a plan that she has to meet with her attorney later in the week.
That's what I thought as well. When I heard your colleague say plan twice, so objection overruled.
Now, Mr. Mars, you heard Miss Lee ask her personal attorney if she could have an appointment later that week, didn't you?
Yeah, that's correct.
And just after hearing this conversation, you went to the pharmacy, right?
Yeah, I ran some errands after I dropped Agatha off at the restaurant.
You went to the pharmacy by yourself, didn't you?
Yeah, I was just driving Agatha, and then when I dropped her off, I went to run errands.
Well, you actually only ran one errand, didn't you?
Yeah, I picked up toiletries at the pharmacy.
So the pharmacy was the only place you went in between dropping off and picking up Miss Lee, right?
Yeah.
And Mr. Mars, of course, you claim that you did not purchase the over-the-counter medication that killed Miss Lee, right?
Yeah, no, I've never purchased chlorantramine in my life.
But you do admit that you paid at the pharmacy in cash.
Yeah, as I typically do for personal expenses.
And you would agree that you threw away your receipt, right?
I didn't take a receipt.
Well, Mr. Mars, you actually did take a receipt, didn't you?
I don't think so. Why do you say that?
Well, you recall when you participated in a deposition, correct?
Oh, yes, that's correct.
And in that deposition, you didn't say you never took a receipt, did you?
I don't think so. It was 2 years ago, and I'm a little fuzzy. I'm sorry.
You stated that you didn't save your receipt, correct?
Right, yes.
Now, Mr. Mars, regardless of if you admit that you purchased the over-the-counter medication that day, you do admit that Miss Lee takes a prescription arthritis medication that looked the same, right?
Yes, Winterin.
They're the same color, aren't they?
Yeah, they're the same color, size, shape, and everything. That's why I was very careful to make sure that no one ever brought chlorantramine into the house, because that would be very dangerous.
You would agree that these medications are identical, correct?
Yes, they look identical.
You also knew that Miss Lee had a severe allergy only to the over-the-counter medication, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The previous in-home caretaker told me that as I started working.
You knew that she had suffered a heart attack after taking just one of these pills previously, right?
Yes, that's what I was told.
And you knew that 2 of these over-the-counter pills would be certain to cause Miss Lee's death, right?
I'm sure if one gave her a heart attack, yes.
Mr. Mars, you would agree that 12 hours after you visited that pharmacy by yourself, Miss Lee was dead, correct?
Yeah, I found her the next morning.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Is there a redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Of course.
Mr. Mars, did you ever purchase chlorantramine?
Absolutely not. I've never purchased chlorantramine in my life.
Did you ever give it to Miss Lee?
No, I would never do that.
Would you ever harm Miss Lee in any way?
No, absolutely not. Like I said, she was like family to me. I would not do that.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. Nothing further.
Is there a recross?
No, Your Honor, no recross.
Okay. Mr. Mars, you are excused with the thanks of the court.
Thank you.
Defense, you may call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, the defense calls Ryan Cabrera.
I'm seeing everyone on the screen. You may proceed when you are ready.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Shelley Cabrera.
Where are you from, Ms. Cabrera?
I'm from Sacramento, California.
What brings you here to Midlands?
I'm a journalist and a biographer. I'm not sure if you've heard of me, but I worked with Random House most recently to work on a book about Gillian Flynn, the author of Gone Girl.
Did you meet Agatha Lee through your job as a biographer?
I did. I feel like I've known Agatha since I was 15 and reading Death in a Bottle. I mean, since then, I've read every single newspaper clipping and snippet that I could find about her. But I guess you're right. I met her in the traditional sense a few years ago.
Ms. Cabrera, how did you actually meet her?
Oh, so I propositioned her in a letter, letting her know that I would love to tell her story to the world. I told her that my writings, if she would read them, were pure nonfiction and that I was very respectful of privacy as well. And for 3 years of radio silence, she finally relented.
When did you first meet her?
I met her a few years ago when I shifted to Midlands. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of a method actor, but I see myself as a method writer. I make sure to entirely immerse myself in the lives of my subjects.
How often did you meet with Miss Lee?
A couple to a few times a week, honestly. We became fast friends over our love of books and board games. My friends tell me that I have an old soul. And I think at this point it's a losing battle.
Did you ever see Miss Lee interact with Drew Mars?
I did quite a lot. They seem like family to me.
What made you think that?
Honestly, Agatha let me know as much. And if I hadn't known any better, when I first met them, I would have thought that Drew was her granddaughter.
Did you ever see Drew act in a hostile way towards Agatha?
No, never. And I couldn't imagine it.
Now, when you visited, did you ever see Stevie Rogers at the house?
I did in the last few months of Agatha's life.
Did you know anything about Agatha's relationship with Stevie?
I did. Agatha didn't have very much family, so naturally we talked about Stevie quite a bit. And I appreciate how candid Agatha was because not all of my subjects are like that. Agatha had lost contact with Stevie in the last several years. She would call and write to Stevie, but phone call after phone call and letter after letter would go unanswered. And honestly, this was a great angle for my book. It took up a whole chapter, but I was secretly hoping that they'd make up and have a happy ending.
Ms. Cabrera, I'd like to shift your attention to the day of August 14th. Did you see Agatha that day?
I did. We made plans and we went to a steakhouse for lunch. I was a little wary because the owner of it was the same owner of the soup franchise and he had been on trial for murder a few years ago, but it was her choice and I just rolled with it.
How did Miss Lee seem that day?
Well, to be honest, I mean, she was down and not her usual chipper self that day.
Do you know why?
Well, I'm no Miss Marple, but Agatha mentioned to me that she was worried that Stevie wouldn't forgive her because Stevie had asked her for something earlier that morning and Agatha had had to say no.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Again, just to clarify for the court before I ask the defense to respond, what statement are you objecting to as hearsay?
The entire statement from Agatha Lee that she had been asked a question by Stevie had to say no. That whole statement, that whole section of dialogue.
Thank you. Defense counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. Under Rule 8033, this is a statement of Miss Lee's mental feeling at the time. The direct quote was Agatha mentioned that she was worried Stevie would not forgive her because she had to tell Stevie no for something she said that morning. Now, Miss Lee relayed to Ms. Cabrera how she was feeling in that moment. That's a statement of under 8033.
Plaintiff's counsel?
Yes, Your Honor, one moment as I pull up the statement. Now, the exception that opposing counsel has stated does apply for the hope that Stevie would forgive Miss Lee. However, the rest of the statement, Stevie asked me for something this morning. I had to say no. I hope I made the right decision. other than the last part, I hope I made the right decision, does not fall under Miss Lee's emotional state. Whether Stevie asked her for something earlier that morning has no bearing on Miss Lee's state of mind at that moment. That is not a statement of her emotional condition.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes. So we're going to treat the "I hope Stevie forgives me" as coming in because I do think 8033 covers that. Counsel,
Yes,
I'm going to give you one chance to address. I don't think the Stevie asked me for something and I had to say no is covered by 8033. So if you have something else you'd like to raise on that, feel free to do so.
Well, yes, Your Honor. We mentioned that when Stevie, like the quote that Stevie asked her for something, does not assert any, we're not using that for the truth of the matter there. Now, it doesn't matter whether what she said to Stevie, merely that Agatha Lee said that that's what happened.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Briefly.
Your Honor, it is the plaintiff's belief that the defense is using this interaction to prove their contention from Drew Mars that Miss Rogers had asked for Miss Lee to put her back in the will. Miss Lee had said no, and she was hoping that Miss Rogers would forgive her for that. Now, while they are not directly eliciting that testimony, because this witness cannot elicit that testimony, they are using it for the truth of the matter that Stevie had asked a question, that Agatha had said no, and that she had felt these things about that interaction. They are using this for the truth of the matter.
Well, I think the defense gets to decide why they're offering it, but I guess I'm going to go back on my word. Defense counsel, let me tell you what the court's concerned about. If you're not offering it for the truth, I'm not sure why it's relevant, and I have significant 403 concerns. So I'm going to give you an attempt to convince me why this statement should come in. I take you at your word that you're not offering it for the truth, but now you need to convince me why it should come in if it's not being offered for the truth.
Yes, Your Honor. This statement provides important context for the way that Agatha seemed that day. Now, this was the day that Agatha Lee died, later that night. And so this context is important for the jury to understand exactly how Agatha Lee was acting and feeling on that day.
I appreciate counsel's argument. I'm going to sustain the objection to the first part of the statement. I think the context is only going to work if we're assuming it's being used for the truth. And I think we're trying to get around the fact remembered carve out to 8033. So I will sustain the objection to the first part of the statement and strike that part of the testimony.
Now, Ms. Cabrera, are you aware when Agatha Lee was killed? I'm sorry, when Agatha Lee died?
Yes. She was murdered later that night sometime on the night of the 14th / the early morning of the 15th.
Thank you, Ms. Cabrera. No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. You may begin your cross when ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Cabrera, you were writing a biography about Miss Agatha Lee, right?
Yes, I was, and hopefully it would also end up on the New York Times bestseller list too.
You were writing that biography because Miss Lee was a famous author?
Yes, and she was one of my favorites.
However, Miss Lee only ever published one book, right?
Yes, I think that might have been what helped her with her fame, honestly. It might have contributed.
Well, you met with her many times to discuss this biography that you were writing, right?
I did.
I'd like to talk about something that you saw in May of 2018. During one of your meetings, you witnessed Mr. Mars giving Miss Lee a purple pill, right?
That sounds about right.
And the defendant began to tell Miss Lee what that pill was?
I think so, yes.
But Miss Lee cut him off, right?
Yes, she was saying something. I don't think it was done maliciously.
Miss Lee said, "You know, I'll take whatever you hand me," right?
Sure, yes.
You had lunch with Miss Lee on August 14th of 2018, right?
I did. Not the best lunch I've had with her, but yes.
That was the day before Miss Lee died.
I think it might have been the day of, according to the autopsy. I mean, I wasn't really sure of what the exact time she died, but yes, it could have been that or the day after.
Well, you're aware that Miss Lee was found on the 15th, right?
Yes.
So it was the day before she was found.
Yes, correct.
So the day before Miss Lee was found dead, she told you she was going to meet with her lawyer, right?
Yeah, so she had finally told me, I think, the answer that everyone had wanted to hear about her unpublished novels and whether she had any. So I was hoping she was going to publish them. And that's what it sounded like.
But she didn't tell you why she was going to meet with her lawyer specifically, right?
No, but we've been talking all afternoon about her unpublished novels.
She's only said that she was meeting with her lawyer on Friday, right?
Yes, I think so. That was the plan.
But Miss Lee died before that Friday, didn't she?
She did.
Less than a week after that lunch, you attended the reading of Miss Lee's will.
I did at Lee Manor.
At the reading of the will, everything of Miss Lee's estate was left to the defendant, right?
Yes. Yes, it was.
And after hearing that he would be inheriting everything, the defendant said, "I can't believe it. I had no idea."
I think so.
And he said that several times, right?
Yes, I think he was just in shock. It sounded like he had a very stressful last couple of weeks.
Despite the fact that the defendant said, "I can't believe it. I had no idea," the fact is you knew the defendant was going to inherit Miss Lee's entire estate beforehand, didn't you?
Yes.
You knew that because Miss Lee herself had told you that the defendant was the sole heir.
Yes, she clearly considered Drew her family.
Ms. Cabrera, you also knew that the defendant was in the room when Miss Lee told you that he was going to be inheriting everything.
Yes.
Let's fast forward to 2 months ago, June of 2020.
Sure.
The defendant called you, right?
In June of 2020, you say?
Yes.
I don't think so.
Ms. Cabrera,
No.
excuse me. You wrote a chapter of a book about the incident with Miss Lee, correct?
Yes, but I talked to Drew in the summer of 2018.
Ms. Cabrera, do you have access to that chapter in front of you right now?
Yes.
Would you were truthful when you wrote that chapter as far as you knew, right?
Yes.
Could you please read aloud for me line 132? Actually, excuse me. Follow along while I read aloud line 132 from your chapter. "I've only spoken to Drew once since the murder trial. In June 2020, Drew called me on the phone," line 133. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did. I'm sorry. I was getting mixed up with my conversations.
So it was in June of this year that the defendant called you, correct?
Yes, my apologies.
That was when the defendant asked you to testify on his behalf today, right?
Yes.
And you said yes, you would.
Yes.
And you're here excuse me. Please continue.
Yes. I knew what Drew and Agatha were like, and so of course I volunteered.
And you're here testifying in this trial willingly.
Yes.
But you stand to gain something if the defense wins today, don't you?
What do you mean?
Well, 2 months ago, right after the defendant asked you to testify, he asked you a question, didn't he?
Yes.
He asked you if you would like to have anything from Miss Lee's estate.
Yes, he did.
Now, I think you mentioned this earlier, but before Miss Lee passed, you discovered that she had unpublished books, right?
Yes, she did.
Those unpublished books, as far as you knew, were on the bookshelf in her study?
I think so.
You actually saw those unpublished books on the bookshelf when you were in the study for the reading of Miss Lee's will, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
At that time, you thought there were at least a dozen of them.
That seemed to be the number.
And you believed that those unpublished books could be valuable, didn't you?
Yes, I mean, no one had ever seen them before, and I'm a huge fan of her books, and the thought that I could read more of them was amazing.
In fact, you can't fathom how much those unpublished books might be worth, can you?
No, they'd be priceless to me, and I've been if there was a fan club of hers, I'd be the president. I just could not wait to read them all.
So when the defendant asked you if you would like anything from Miss Lee's estate, you asked for those books.
Yes, that was after I had agreed to testify in the trial.
The defendant responded, if the civil trial ends and I am still in possession of Agatha's estate, those books are all yours.
Yes.
So to be clear, as far as you're aware, if the defendant wins this case today, you will receive those unfathomably valuable unpublished books.
Yes, I think that's what will happen. I'm not entirely sure.
To your understanding, you will receive those books if the defendant wins this case, right?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Is there a redirect?
Brief redirect, Your Honor. Ms. Cabrera, would you have agreed to testify here today if you weren't getting those books you were just asked about?
Yes, of course. I mean, Drew and Agatha were like family. In fact, they acted like it almost all of the time. And I agreed to testify in this trial before I even knew about the possibility of me getting to read the books, because I just knew that Drew would never have done this.
Is your receiving of those books contingent upon what your testimony is?
No, not at all. Drew could have never have done this, and I'd love to read them, but not at the expense of lying in court.
Thank you, Ms. Cabrera. No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Is there a recross?
There is not, Your Honor.
Ms. Cabrera, you are excused with the thanks of the court. Is there any further evidence from the defense?
No, Your Honor. With that, the defense rests its case in chief.
Okay. Well, under the rules of this jurisdiction, that means we go directly into closing arguments. I'm going to ask my fellow judges to please return your Zoom to speaker view. Again, that is the upper right-hand corner. So the only person on the screen should then be the speaker. And I would also ask the other closer to please mute so that we will only see the person who is speaking during the closing. And with that, plaintiff's counsel, you may begin your closing argument.
Yes, Your Honor. Is it okay if I keep my camera muted for just a couple more seconds to set up the room?
Of course.
Thank you. May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury. 12 years ago, the defendant, Drew Mars, was hired to be a caretaker. It turned out to be an amazing job. The defendant was paid well, was given insurance, had no living expenses, but the defendant needed more. Because the defendant had a sick brother that needed medical attention and money was slowly running out. By 2018, with no other family to speak of, the defendant was made the sole heir of Miss Lee's will. The defendant was informed of this and knew it meant $20 million would be coming his way. But the defendant needed more. Not only was the defendant's money running out, but now so was the time left to treat his sick brother. Just 5 months later, in July of 2018, Miss Lee gets something she always wanted. Her long-lost granddaughter returns and they reconnect. They become so close that ultimately, Miss Lee makes Miss Rogers the sole heir of her estate. And this is the moment when the defendant, who was running out of money and now running out of time, decided to kill Miss Lee. And that's why we're here in court today. Stevie Rogers is suing Drew Mars for the wrongful death of her grandmother, Agatha Lee. But what exactly does that mean? Well, first, in a wrongful death suit, we must ask ourselves, has somebody died by unnatural causes? The answer may seem obvious because everyone agrees here that Agatha Lee is dead. But how she died, is that significant? Well, Miss Lee died from an allergic reaction to an over-the-counter medication, and members of the jury, this tells us some crucial information about her killer. The killer had to know about the allergy. The killer had to have access to her prescription medication, and the killer had to handle Miss Lee's prescription medication in order to make the switch that ultimately killed her. So we've established by a preponderance of the evidence, or more likely than not, that someone died of unnatural causes. The bigger question is, did the defendant make that switch that killed Miss Lee? Now that we know some facts about the killer, it becomes more and more clear who caused her death. The defendant was one of the only people who knew about her allergic reaction. The defendant was the only person who had access to her medication, and the defendant was a certified nurse, which means that the defendant knew that her prescription arthritis medication matched the over-the-counter medication she was allergic to exactly. And members of the jury, this is where the proof comes in. The proof is in the prints that were left on that prescription medication. So now that we have established by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant caused the death of Miss Lee, we have to do one more thing. The death is only wrongful if it wasn't an accident. We had to prove that the defendant knowingly caused this death. Now, Midland's Penal Code defines knowingly as actions that a person is practically certain will cause a certain outcome. So, did the defendant knowingly switch those pills, causing Miss Lee's death? Well, all that we have to do to figure out the answer to that question is to look at her last day of life. At 11:30 a.m., the defendant leaves Lee Manor, driving Miss Lee's car to drop her off at lunch with Ryan Cabrera. At 12 p.m., the defendant drops Miss Lee off, and an hour and a half later, she arrives to pick her up. They make their way back to Lee Manor and arrive back at 2 p.m. At 6:30, the defendant serves dinner to Miss Lee and Miss Rogers in Miss Lee's study. And between 9:35 and 9:40, the defendant was seen going into Miss Lee's room. Now, members of the jury, we know that the defendant was seen at 9:35 p.m. But we also know that the defendant stated that they hadn't seen Miss Lee alive after 6:30. Why? So I want to ask you something, members of the jury. Why would the defendant lie about going back into Miss Lee's bedroom at 9:35 p.m.? The defendant was Miss Lee's caretaker. It wasn't abnormal for him to go back into Miss Lee's room. So if the defendant wasn't doing something that he shouldn't have been doing, why lie? Well, let's look at what the defendant did earlier that day to answer that question. Recall what the defendant heard just before taking Miss Lee to lunch. The defendant heard that Miss Lee was so happy that her granddaughter had returned that she was leaving her estate to Miss Rogers. The defendant then received confirmation of this change when she heard Miss Lee call her personal attorney on the drive to lunch and request an appointment for later that week. Immediately after dropping off Miss Lee, the defendant visits a local pharmacy. And don't forget, members of the jury, the drug that killed Miss Lee was an over-the-counter medication available in 15 pharmacies in Ryder County alone with no ID required for purchase. As we know, with the pills in tow, the defendant drives Miss Lee home, and just hours later, Miss Lee would be dead. So I ask again, why lie? Because between 9:35 and 9:40 p.m., when the defendant was seen going into Miss Lee's room, he was switching those pills. And how do we know the defendant was switching those pills? Members of the jury, fingerprints. The proof is in those prints. Those prints are on both of the pills Miss Lee should have taken that night, and those prints are those of the defendant. hold him accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, you may close when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. In a case like this one, when someone is accused of killing another person, what evidence would you expect to hear? You might expect to hear from an eyewitness, someone who actually saw the crime happen. You might expect to see some evidence that directly links the accused to the murder weapon. You might expect to hear from the lead investigator in the case. But that's not what you've heard today. Because Mr. Mars was framed for a fortune. Over and over today, we've heard Ms. Wandrow say the proof is in the prints and the prints are on the pills. But ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't add up. You see, they said that Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee for inheritance. But members of the jury, when Ms. Wandrow says the proof is on the pills, she's not talking about the poison. She's talking about the pills that Drew Mars handled nightly. The pills that were for Miss Lee's arthritis. You see, this plaintiff's case revolves around Miss Rogers' uncorroborated account of one conversation. Miss Rogers will have you believe that on August 14th, just 1 month after moving back in with her grandma, well, she was written back into her will. But Miss Mars told us that that conversation went differently than Miss Rogers said. He told us that Miss Rogers begged to be put back into Miss Lee's will, but ultimately Miss Lee said no. So ladies and gentlemen, what do we do? With two conflicting accounts of the same conversation. Well, we look to the evidence. Miss Rogers was out of her grandmother's life for 8 years, ignoring her calls, her emails, living off her $2 million trust fund. As Agatha Lee put it, she was disinherited just 6 months earlier because she'd never held a job and she treated her grandmother as her personal ATM. So does it make any sense that after just 1 month together, despite Miss Rogers still not holding a job, that Miss Lee was suddenly okay with Miss Rogers suddenly okay with putting Miss Rogers back in the will? Suddenly okay with Miss Rogers using her as a personal ATM once again? Of course not. What makes sense is Miss Lee telling Miss Rogers, once again, that she needed to stand on her own 2 feet. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not just Mr. Mars telling us that's how his conversation went. It's also Miss Cabrera. Because remember, just a few hours after that conversation, Miss Lee told Miss Cabrera that she was worried that Stevie would never forgive her. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think she was talking about? Was Miss Lee worried that Stevie wouldn't forgive her for putting her back into the will? No. She was worried because she told Stevie no. And members of the jury, without Miss Rogers' lies about that conversation, the plaintiff's allegation is nothing more than that. Their entire case rests on speculation and the word of Miss Rogers. And it's the plaintiff that carries the burden today. They had to prove to you, by preponderance of the evidence, that Miss Mars was responsible for the death of Miss Lee. They haven't been able to prove that to you. In fact, they haven't been able to prove to you that Mr. Mars switched out Miss Lee's medication for chlorandramine. They haven't even been able to prove to you that Mr. Mars ever even purchased chlorandramine. Because Mr. Mars was framed for a fortune. Now let's look at the witnesses they called to prove it. We heard from Mr. Bond, the private detective. We didn't hear from Detective Kahn, the police investigator on the case. We didn't hear from Dr. Quincy, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy. No, we heard from a detective for hire who responds to whoever's paying his fee. And in this case, Mr. Bond was being paid $25,000 to sell you Miss Rogers' version of the facts. We also heard from Miss Rogers. Ms. Rogers, who stands to gain $20 million in cash, $3 million in royalties, and a $2 million house. We heard that Ms. Rogers was desperate for money. She'd never had a job, and she'd burned through her $2 million trust fund, then been removed from her grandmother's will. So she formed a plan. As we heard, Ms. Rogers knew of the Slayer statute before Miss Lee ever passed away. She knew that if Miss Lee died and Mr. Mars was shown to be responsible, well, then she'd inherit it all. The $20 million, the $3 million in royalties, the $2 million home. So she put her plan into action on August 14th, once Miss Lee refused to include her in the will once more. On cross-examination, Miss Rogers was forced to admit that she knew of her grandmother's fatal allergy, and she knew that Mr. Mars was the one who handled the medication. So when Miss Rogers was home alone that day, for hours, she switched out her grandmother's medication for the chlorantramine pills, knowing Mr. Mars would be the first suspect. She needed to be sure that he'd go down for it, though, so she snuck into his bedroom and planted the pills in his closet. But Miss Rogers wasn't done. She knew for her story to be believable, she needed to create a motive for Mr. Mars to have committed this crime. And ladies and gentlemen, what better way to do that than to create her own version of that earlier conversation? A version of that conversation in which Mr. Mars happens to be losing everything. All she had to do now was wait. The next morning, Miss Rogers immediately called her grandmother's death a murder. She insisted on a talk screen the second the police arrived, because she knew exactly what it would show. Ladies and gentlemen, she was so sure that she filed this exact lawsuit that we're here today for, before her grandmother's death was shown to be anything other than a woman dying in her sleep. Because Mr. Mars was framed for a fortune. We're not here today because the actions of Drew Mars. We're not here today because Agatha Lee randomly passed away one night. No, we're here today because of a plan that Stevie Rogers crafted while her grandmother was still alive. A plan that would leave her $20 million richer. But Miss Rogers didn't plan for everything. Miss Rogers didn't plan for it to come to light that she knew of the Slayer statute prior to her grandmother's death. Miss Rogers didn't plan for Agatha Lee to tell Miss Cabrera about their conversation that morning. But most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, Miss Rogers didn't plan for you. Now you can stop Miss Rogers' plan from working. You can be sure that Mr. Mars receives his full inheritance, just as Miss Lee insisted on her final day alive. You can be the one to see that Drew Mars isn't framed for a fortune. Find Mr. Mars not liable.
Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, do you have a rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Prior to beginning my rebuttal, I would just like to draw the court's attention to evidentiary ruling number 19. This reads, through no fault of either party, Detective Nora Khan is unavailable within the meaning of MRE 804A.
All right.
I also believe that I have 45 seconds left for rebuttal. Can my timekeeper confirm that?
Yes, Ellen, it's like 43 seconds.
Thank you. Members of the jury, defense counsel got up here and told you about that the fingerprints of the defendant don't matter because they were on the prescription medication Miss Lee took every night. But what he didn't tell you is that there was a bottle of this prescription medication containing 14 pills. Of those, only 2 contained prints. Why? because these were the 2 pills that were removed from Miss Lee's pill organizer and put back into their bottle as the medication she was deathly allergic to replaced them. I'd also like to call your attention to the testimony of Stevie Rogers, who claimed that she didn't even know her grandmother had arthritis. Therefore, she could not have switched the pills. Find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right. My understanding that we're supposed to do now is that we're supposed to wait for instructions from our bailiff. So thank you. I'll wait for instructions from our bailiff.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Now that the trial has concluded, I'm going to send the students outside into the break rooms once again and give the judges an opportunity to complete their ballots. Okay. The students should all be heading out, so